Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. It's been a little over 2 years since Edward Snowden revealed to the world the extent of surveillance of U.S. citizens by our own government, and it's been a topic of conversation ever since. But there's another aspect of surveillance that hasn't been so much of a topic of conversation, and that's the use of very similar surveillance technologies by local police departments. And that's what we're going to talk about on this month's edition of Other Voices: surveillance as a local issue and what we can do about it. Joining me to help us understand what's going on and what we can do about it, I'm glad to be joined by Adam Schwartz, Senior Staff Attorney with the Electronic Freedom Foundation, where he works on their civil liberties team. Adam, welcome to Other Voices.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming by tonight. Adam used to work for 19 years with the ACLU in Chicago, was it?
Yes.
In Chicago on some of the same issues, on addressed youth prisons, police detentions, surveillance cameras, fusion centers, drones, location tracking. Sounds like you've been involved in this work for quite a long time.
I have. I'm lucky to be at the EFF now.
Yeah, take just a minute or so and tell us a little bit about what Electronic Frontier Foundation does, just in case folks aren't familiar with it.
Sure. The Electronic Frontier Foundation was founded in 1990, and its mission is to ensure that the new technologies that are changing the world around us make us more free as opposed to less free. We have about 75 employees. We are producing technology. We have activists. We are lobbying state houses and Congress across the country. And we have a legal team, which is bringing lawsuits and filing amicus briefs and enforcing public records requests in order to advance digital liberty in the new frontier. We have a team that's working on intellectual property. We're working on national security. And there also is a big focus on the issue at hand tonight, which is local police using sophisticated and powerful new technologies to spy upon the general public.
All right, and I want to get to that, but I can't resist making this note that since you did work for ACLU for 19 years, several years ago I had on Danny O'Brien from Electronic Freedom Foundation. I think he's now your international director.
Yes.
He was more a local director then. And an attorney from the ACLU whose name I don't remember. Danny was dressed in some wild t-shirt and his scraggly beard, and the guy from the ACLU was here in a coat and tie and stuff. And I've always had this image of, that's the difference between these two civil liberties groups, both of which I have tremendous respect for. Is that true now that you've worked for both? You've been at the EFF for about a year.
I'm the luckiest man in the world because I've had the chance to work both for the ACLU and for the EFF. I have not changed my wardrobe. I would say I was
I was kind of disappointed you didn't come in a t-shirt tonight to keep up the image.
For the record, for everyone who wasn't watching earlier this evening, I was originally wearing a sports coat, but they made me take it off.
It contrasted with, it clashed with, or actually blended into our background. Let's get into let's start with the technology and what we're talking about, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of a lot of these things that are out there that police departments are using right now, have been for many years. More police departments are getting all the time. And I want to kind of, I think, go up the ladder to a little less controversial to more controversial. So let's start with, for example, license plate readers. I live in Palo Alto, and they installed license plate readers about 1.5 years ago. And except for 1 or 2 letters to the editor in the Los Altos Town Crier, there was almost nothing said about it. The police just got them. Tell us about license plate readers and what they're for and what kind of data they're collecting.
Sure. So what a automatic license plate reader is, an ALPR, is a camera that can accurately snap the photograph of the license plates of cars that are whizzing by, and very rapidly run those plates, turn them into computer code, and run them against databases of cars that are of interest to the police, and to save those numbers, including where and when the cars were. There is one use of the ALPR system which is of concern but of less concern, which is trying to catch wanted people going by. So if, for example, there is an Amber Alert and a child has been kidnapped and they know the plate of the car, they're looking for that car going by.
So are these stationary installed cameras, or are they on police cars?
They're both.
They're both.
Sometimes they're stationary, sometimes they're driving
Okay.
around in police cars.
Okay.
Some of each.
Go ahead.
We don't love that use of the LPR. And by the way, studies are done, including one recently involving Marin, just up the road from here, found that of all the cars going by, and there are millions from just a small number of cameras in a few months, less than 0.02% of the cars going by are on a watch list of some kind. Where the technology becomes much more frightening and frankly Orwellian is that law enforcement is retaining the data, even if the cars that went by are among the vast majority of people who are not on a police database. So in other words, what the government is doing is building up a database of where all the people are all the time that they're driving around in cars in case they want the information later, for example, to investigate a case.
So let me make sure I understand this. So say they have a camera set up at First and Main in Los Altos, and I drive by at noon on a Monday. They keep the information that I drove by at noon on Monday at First and Main?
Well, I want to be careful.
Okay.
There are thousands of police departments across the country. There are studies to suggest, thousands of them at this point have the license plate readers, and there's a lot of different policies. From the perspective of the EFF and other digital liberty advocates, the enlightened approach, to answer your question, would be you drive by, in about a second, the computer figures out what your plate is, that it is not, I'm going to assume, out of kindness to you, that
I have no outstanding warrants.
Exactly. You're not one of the wanted people, and the computer says that one's not wanted, and it instantaneously erases the information.
Yeah.
From our perspective at the EFF, there should be no record that an innocent person has driven by an ALPR. Unfortunately, that's not the norm. I can't speak to what the policy is in Mountain View or Palo Alto or anywhere in particular. Unfortunately, what is the default is that agencies are keeping this information for years. And there's another layer to this, which is that there is a company called Vigilant, which is producing many of the ALPRs across America. And they enter contracts with law enforcement where they sell the technology less expensively than Vigilant might otherwise sell it. And in exchange, all the data that's being gathered is given by the police departments to Vigilant. And so now Vigilant has...
So they're keeping all the records.
Correct. And now Vigilant has a database of billions of hits of driver's license of innocent people who happen to have driven by 4th and Main in Palo Alto or wherever it is. And then they sell access to their database of ALPR hits to law enforcement agencies, or for that matter, private collection agencies who want to find out where people are. And from the perspective of EFF, this is very chilling.
Yeah.
What we would say is that before any technology like this is adopted, rules should be put in place. And foremost on the list for ALPRs is if the vehicle going by is not one of the 0.02% bad guys, or for that matter, traffic scofflaws who they want to collect a $100 ticket on. If you're not in that 0.02%, the computer does not keep a record that you were there.
Yeah, that seems more than logical. Who else is in Vigilant's market? They're not making their money just selling to collection agencies, are they?
I think much of their money is being made from selling the technology, the machines, as well as the information to law enforcement agencies. But they do have some private markets, such as the collection agencies, on the side.
So I know in doing some of my background reading for this that California, apparently, I think as of last year, had a state law that requires local police departments that have ALPRs, these license plate readers, to prominently post on their websites their policies and procedures about these. Is that right?
That's right. In 2015, two very good bills were enacted with support from EFF and many other digital advocates, digital liberty advocates, one dealing with ALPRs and one dealing with cell site simulators, which we'll talk about a little bit later, I assume. And as you say, they require agencies that have these technologies to have policies that go on their website. And in fact, what they say is that before the technologies go into force, there has to be a notice and comment period of the proposed policies so the public can be heard raising their concerns.
Okay. And I know EFF did a little survey of California cities to see how well they were complying. And inspired by that, I looked up on the Los Altos Police Department website, and sure enough, right there on their homepage, item 4 or 5 was ALPR policy, and I clicked on that, and it brought up a page, and there it was. So I checked out Palo Alto, and on their page it said ALPR policy, and I clicked on that, and it took me to page 1 of a non-HTML document, a full text document of some 500 pages. And it was sometime later that I found the policy right there on page 356.
I would say the technology is improving, but it's not there yet. I mentioned earlier that the EFF advances our mission through many tools, one of which is activism. And so a thing we periodically do is bring together a room full of digital hacktivists, as well as people who are connected online. And we essentially held a day where everybody in the room was looking for these policies. The law that went into effect in 2015 said if you've got an ALPR, you've got to have a policy on your website. So we just went to the website.
And the law says prominently displayed, or some language to that effect.
Yep, and we went to hundreds of government websites, law enforcement websites across California, and we compiled, I think it was more than 100 of the
it was a long list
of the different agencies who had put up their policies. Unfortunately, there are agencies that we knew had ALPRs, but were not yet posting. So progress is being made. Many agencies are obeying the law, but not all of them yet.
Yeah, in fact, when I first went to the Los Altos one, it was a broken link. So I sent them an email and it was fixed the next day. Citizen activism. So this might be a worthwhile pursuit for local activists, is to review their own department policies, and especially the data retention.
Yes.
And maybe try to get it changed so that non-hits, innocent people, don't get retained in these databases.
That's right. There's kind of a cycle of government capture of personally identifiable information. And the first stage is the point of capture. With ALPRs, I don't particularly like this, but the horse has kind of left the barn. That the government is, there are not very many legal limits on when they start capturing. And then the next points in this kind of life cycle of personally identifiable information captured by the government. You've got their usage of it, their sharing of it, and then their ultimate, hopefully, destruction of it. And with the LPRs, the most important piece, again, as you've just said, is that the information is kept for as short a time as possible. And in the case of LPRs and the 99% plus of people who are not on one of the watch lists, the ideal retention time is 0 seconds.
0, yeah. All right, let's move on into yet scarier area, drones, which
Yes.
more and more police departments are getting. I think most infamously in this area, San Jose Police Department went out and got themselves a drone. Weren't even sure what they were going to do with it. Didn't tell anybody they were buying a drone. Just one day they had a drone, as I understand how it went down.
Right. So the drone is disturbing for many reasons. And I think it's self-evident to everyone what the drone is. It's an unmanned flying vehicle. Typically, in the case of a domestic law enforcement drone, it's much smaller than this table, for example. And what the government is doing with them is surveillance, typically some kind of sophisticated camera that's looking down. It might have other tools for capturing information besides a camera, depending on what the agency wants to do. As these tools become smaller and smaller and quieter, it is harder for the public to know when they are under surveillance. A generation ago, if the government wanted to have an eye in the sky, it meant an airplane or a helicopter. And the public knew when these tools were being used against them. And there was a real break in terms of how many the government could use, which was money. You can only afford so many helicopters and so much person power to fly and fuel and maintain a helicopter. But these drones with very advanced cameras attached to them are becoming less and less expensive. And one can easily imagine, swarms of these technologies, in the air.
All too easily imagine that, yeah.
Yeah. Now, of course, an engine driving the train here, both about the ALPRs and about the drones and about all the other technologies, is that there's this endless flow of money from the federal government in grants to state and local government to buy more and more technology. So as the technology on the price side is getting less and less expensive, the money coming in from the federal government to buy it is becoming more and more available. And so it's basically very easy from a financial perspective for agencies to get more and more of these technologies, which are so dangerous to our liberty.
What's the federal government's role in this? Is this supposed to be anti-terrorism stuff?
Correct.
So is it Department of Homeland Security that's issuing these grants to?
Principally, sometimes Department of Justice as well, but much of it is DHS money.
Do you have a handle on how much?
Billions of dollars
Billions.
Since the war on terror began has flowed from the federal government to state and local government for the purpose of purchasing these sophisticated, invasive technologies.
Now, as I was looking through, I didn't see much that has made it into the courts or anything about drones. Has anything like that come up where someone has challenged on a civil liberties basis particular use of local police using drones?
I think that there has not been yet a great deal of litigation about the drones. I think in part because they have not been as used as some of the other technologies that we have been talking about. There has, fortunately, been legislation enacted by a number of states and cities to regulate the drones. When we talk about civil liberties legislation to restrain the use of these technologies, it kind of tracks the life cycle I talked about before. And the gold standard at the front end of whether or not to even be collecting is a warrant from a judge based on probable cause. And I'm happy to say that there are jurisdictions, including the entire state of Illinois, but many other across the country, who have said, law enforcement, if you want to put a drone in the air to gaze down upon a target of your law enforcement investigations, before you do that, go to a judge and get a warrant based on probable cause.
What about news in terms of street demonstrations and marches and things like that? Filming, retaining records of who was there. I know when we put on marches and rallies, even here in Palo Alto, the police department is always out there with at least a couple of people with video cameras, and they say it's, in case something happens, we have a record. But I can see the drone having the capacity to visually record the face, and now we have facial recognition software of everyone who was at that rally.
Yeah, I think when we talk about technologies and the burdens on our constitutional liberties, we've been talking so far about what might be the Fourth Amendment concern, which is our freedom of privacy and our freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. But there's two other pieces of the puzzle, one of which you've just raised, which is the First Amendment piece, which is that when the government deploys these technologies and aims them at First Amendment activity, protests, rallies, parades, vigils, leafleting, whatever it is, it has the tendency to chill and deter and discourage people from engaging in these activities. So just, for example, there is a published study earlier this year about how people behave on social media when they find out that the government is surveilling social media. And the answer is people use it less, and they express unpopular or unconventional opinions less. So there is direct scholarly confirmation of what is intuitively obvious, which is that when people are afraid the government is spying on them, they stop going to rallies and they stop expressing dissident or unpopular opinions.
Or even stop signing petitions or
Sure,
all
sure.
kinds of stuff.
And the third piece, which I'm sure you'll get to,
Yeah.
you know, the privacy concern, the free speech concern is, of course, the color of surveillance, the racial justice concern.
Yeah. You just mentioned social media, and you mentioned something before we turned the cameras on that I don't think I was aware of: automatic social media trackers. So they've automated the social media tracking. I take that's what that title means.
Yes, yes. So, for example, the city of Oakland has retained the services of a company that's called Geofeedia, F-E-E-D-A. And what Geofeedia does is geographically isolate a set of live social media. So, for example, a demonstration occurring in downtown Oakland, and then do word searches within all of the social media occurring live in that particular location in order to identify, you know, whatever the police are interested in. Now, you know, having just said what I said a moment ago about the tendency of people to be chilled from exercising their constitutional freedom of speech by the knowledge that the government is spying on them, you know, we view the application of automated social media tracking to a protest to be very destructive and not proper.
Absolutely. So what kind of keywords are they searching on, and have there been any cases on this where it's been challenged, so we know a little bit more about what the police are trying to accomplish? I mean, if you have a peaceful march out, you know, they have to guard against maybe some violence breaking out, but what is their logic, their rationale for searching social media live while these demonstrations are going on? How's that supposed to enhance their...
I think from the perspective of law enforcement, what they are scared of is violent activity or of nonviolent civil disobedience that is disruptive to traffic flow and, you know, the ordinary functioning of the city. And they want to gather intelligence before and during the protest that will tell them where the unlawful activity is going to take place, so they can, you know, stop it before it starts or minimize its impact. What the EFF believes is that's not a good enough reason to be spying on law-abiding people who are engaged in their First Amendment right to protest. Now, exactly what kind of word searches and use Oakland is making, I don't know the answer to that. I would like to know, and I wish that Oakland was subject to, or the Oakland police was subject to laws that would require them on a regular basis to tell us, you know, what kind of word searches they were doing and what they were getting. What I can say is that police departments across the United States have been running the words Black Lives Matter through their social media trackers. The movement for Black Lives has suffered terrible surveillance of their First Amendment nonviolent activity for several years now. And I think it's really Exhibit A of what is wrong with these technologies.
Yeah, and I assume that surveillance takes place before the action is occurring.
Exactly.
So, you know, my activism goes back to the 60s and COINTELPRO, and we were being spied on a lot there then, and it seems like this has not changed. It's just gotten better.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, you know, when I worked for the ACLU in Chicago, you know, I spent several years involved in the attempt to maintain the consent decree that Chicago had with, the Chicago police had with the ACLU regarding police spying. And, you know, what they did in the old days was have a police officer stand outside of the political meeting and write down the license plates of all the cars that were entering the parking lots in order to figure out who they were. Well, now there's all kinds of other, you know, ways that use much less person power to figure out the identities of the people, you know, coming in.
The license plate reader.
The license plate reader. They could use facial recognition and a camera. They can use the social media trackers. They could use drones, you know, using the cameras and the facial recognition. There's no end to the ways that it is cheaper, faster, easier, more secretive for the government to gather more information than, you know, 40 years ago when it was a obviously undercover police officer standing outside, you know, writing down a bunch of license plate numbers in his little pad before the the political meeting.
Yeah. How is it that Black Lives Matter came to learn that they were being spied on in these various electronic manners, and what have they done about it?
I think a lot of it was Public Record Act requests. A lot of it is investigative journalism. I think, fortunately, it is often hard when you've got so many police departments with so many employees doing the same thing across the country to keep it a secret. And I think a lot of organizations, Black Lives Matter, ACLU, others, have tried to draw attention to this problem, to use it as an example of what goes wrong when police get their hands on these technologies, some of them at all, but all of them without sufficient safeguards to ensure that people's privacy is being protected.
And that goes to one of the problems here. You know, you mentioned what you wish you could do and find out in Oakland, but you could fight for 2 years to change policies in Oakland around these social media trackers, and yet you'd have to fight the same fight right next door in Berkeley or in Alameda, because these are all local police departments and they only come under municipal law.
Yep.
Unless we get something done at the state level.
That's correct.
It's like whack-a-mole for our civil liberties.
It is. I think that every one of the different police departments is adopting some of these technologies. So with the drones, they've got it in Alameda County and in San Jose. With the ALPRs, it's all over. With the the next thing I don't know that you might want to talk to is the cell site simulators.
I definitely want to get to that. Social media trackers, do you have any idea where?
The only one I know of in the Bay Area is Oakland, but I know that in California, especially in the Central Valley, there are several other jurisdictions that are known to have them.
Okay, yeah. You just brought up the cell site simulators, and to me, this is really the big one. I think people are acutely aware of how sensitive and vulnerable their cell phones are, especially now that we all have them in our pockets and purses and things. So first, what are cell site simulators? How are the police using them? And then, and the problems.
So our cell phones, when they're turned on, are in constant dialogue with the cell towers. Basically, they're constantly saying back and forth, I'm a cell tower, I'm a phone, and they're trying to be in touch with each other so that when we want to do something like make a phone call, they're already prepped. And so a cell site simulator is a device that pretends to be a cell tower. And it sends out the message, I'm a cell tower, even though it's not. And the phones respond by identifying themselves. Sometimes these tools are called IMSI catchers. IMSI is a unique number that's inside every cell phone. Sometimes
that's IMSI, right?
Correct.
It's some kind of.
I know that the first letter is international, but I don't know what MSI stands for. But
I looked it up and I don't remember what it was.
Sometimes they're called Stingrays because the leading producer, Harris Corporation's, one of their most popular products is the Stingray. They're sometimes called Kingfisher. Sometimes they called dirt boxes because one of the producers is called DRT. So the two principal things that law enforcement is doing with them is finding out the location of a known phone. So if there's a person they want to arrest, if there is a person who's been kidnapped, they know the phone number, but they don't know where the person is. They turn on their cell site simulator and find out where they are. The other thing is if there's a particular spot where they know a phone is, but they don't know who is there, they will find out the IMSI number of that telephone and then work backwards to figure out who that person is. Those are probably the two most common uses, but there's other potential uses. They can do anything a cell phone tower can do. So they can capture the content of a phone call. They can capture the metadata of a phone call. They can jam the phone calls. So they're potentially very disruptive technology.
So if they're simulating cell phone towers, I would presume that if they had a strong case that they wanted to track somebody down, and I may be way off base about this, but couldn't they go to a judge and get a warrant and get this information from the actual cell phone tower from the phone company?
Yeah, so I think For a long time, what law enforcement has wanted to do is find wanted people. And before the cell site simulator, they would do exactly what you said. And in fact, to this day, they still do that, which is the providers have this information too. All of us have contracts with the company, and the company, for its own reasons, for many months at a time, keeps a record of all of the cell towers that have been near our telephone. It's called historical cell site location information. And police go to the phone companies and say, give me the location information on so-and-so, Adam. And a battle that is being fought out right now across the country in the courts, and which has divided the courts, and may very soon go to the U.S. Supreme Court, is whether or not when the police go to the phone companies and say, give us the cell site location information, do they have to first go to a judge and get a warrant based on probable cause? Now, it should not surprise you that from the perspective of the EFF, the answer, of course, is yes. But there are groups who...
You are such sticklers for the Constitution.
Exactly. And we think the same thing for the cell site simulators, which have a parallel function of the police finding out where we are. We haven't talked yet about the significance of location privacy, and this goes to the ALPRs, it goes to the cell site, the simulators, it goes to other police technologies. Please. They can stick a GPS on your car, they could go to the phone company and get the historical records. There's all kinds of things that, they could call OnStar to get at the GPS devices that are embedded in our cars. And what all these things have in common is they are invading our location privacy. What is critical to understand is that if the government knows where we are, the government knows who we are. Are we going to a political rally? Are we visiting a criminal defense lawyer? Are we getting contraception from a reproductive health care facility? Are we going to a bar with our friends that our wives might or might not want us to be visiting with? There's no end to the intrusions on privacy that are inherently shown by disclosing where we are at particular times. And given the sensitivity of this information, what the Supreme Court held 4 years ago in the famous Jones decision is that when the government tracks our location, it is an intrusion on our privacy of constitutional magnitude. And so we at EFF and other groups think if the government is going to do this to us, whether it's through the cell site simulators, whether it's going to the phone companies, whether it's sticking a GPS in our car, in the words of Justice Roberts, come back with a warrant.
What was the Jones decision? Remind.
Sure.
Was that the GPS one where they did?
Yes, and I apologize. I'm briefly turning into a lawyer as opposed to
that's
a
okay.
human communicator.
That is why I asked you here tonight. But
yeah, so in Jones, the government took a GPS device and stuck it on someone's car who was, I believe, a suspected drug dealer, and they watched everywhere they drove their car for a period of 30 days. And the Supreme Court unanimously agreed that this intrusion on the privacy of the person triggered constitutional protection. Now, just how much protection that is what's being fought out in the courts right now. And the courts had a variety of reasons to get to that result. But the important thing is that the court unanimously agreed that when the government invades our location privacy, it has constitutional consequences, and people are entitled to at least some protection of their privacy.
So does that decision cover police use of these cell site simulators? It sounds almost, it's not quite as good as sticking a device on somebody's car and following them around on a little map on your laptop, but it's pretty close.
Yeah, that is an issue that's being fought out in the courts right now. So there are decisions of judges that say, wait a second, this is so invasive of privacy that yes, you do need to come to get a warrant, and the evidence you collected with your cell site simulator without a warrant, it's thrown out because of a violation of the Constitution. Fortunately, there has been some momentum towards adopting rules that require this. So the Department of Justice last year issued a rule that says all of its component parts, including the FBI, need to get a warrant before they deploy their cell site simulators. There are some jurisdictions here in California who have that rule. I think Oakland adopted that rule. Incidentally, what happened in Oakland is that the sheriff, maybe this is Alameda County and not not Oakland, one of the two. The law enforcement had the old generation of cell site simulator, but as the telephone network has improved, it's necessary for police to upgrade their Stingrays. And they went to the government authority and said, we need money to do this. And there was such a hue and cry that they had to adopt significant restraints on their use of the cell site simulator, including a warrant requirement.
Ah.
And by the way, it's not just Oakland and Alameda. It's also San Jose and San Francisco have these powerfully intrusive technologies.
I want to get to what we do about this, but there was one thing I came across, and this might be a little bit into the legal weeds, but I think people need to hear about this. I was reading about a case that arose in Maryland over the use of the cell site simulators kind of as GPS trackers. And they went to a judge and got a warrant, but it was based on like an old wiretap thing. They didn't tell them they were going to use a cell site simulator. And finally, after they arrested the person who was on trial or suspected of something, and he was being brought to trial, and they wanted to find out, the defense team wanted to find out how they found him in his place. And for months and months, the prosecution wouldn't tell them. And finally they did. They said it was a cell site simulator. And when this all came out in, I guess it was the Maryland Supreme Court, they said, why didn't you tell them? Well, because when the FBI gave them a grant to buy this, they made the police department sign a non-disclosure agreement that they were using this stuff.
Yeah,
What?
I'm really glad you raised that point, and this really is perhaps for the overall session we're having this evening, the most important point. So police in America have been using the cell site simulator for more than a decade.
Yeah.
The public has known about it for only a few years, and it's really just the last year that meaningful privacy protections have put in place. Now, why is this? It's because the government has kept it a secret. So this is just upside down world.
Yeah.
In a democracy, law enforcement is only legitimate if the tools it is using have been vetted through the democratic process. And what we have instead, as I call this upside down world, is where the government adopts the most invasive technologies, which were developed in foreign battle zones to use against armed enemies, bring them home, keep it a secret from the general public for the better part of a decade. And really, to rub salt in the wounds, isn't just deceiving the general public, but is giving, I'll be charitable and say, very misleading information to judges who do have some hand in this. And so what you're referring to, there is a technology that is known kind of peculiarly as a pen register trap and trace device. And basically what that means is it is a tool that is used by the phone company to track who is calling who and when.
Yeah.
And so the government, police departments across America for a decade have been saying to judges, Judge, can I have a warrant to install, a pen register trap and trace device? When really what they're doing...
Which is apparently non-controversial. It's been around for a long, long time.
Correct. And it requires a very low threshold of suspicion of crime to get permission to do it. And so they've been pretending to do this, tried and tested, limited intrusion of privacy, when really they're using what is a much more sophisticated and much more intrusive tool. And so not only is the public as a whole, being kept in the dark, but the judiciary for many years has been misled. And in many cases, as happened with the Maryland Court of Appeals decision that you mentioned, there have been many unhappy judges about
They don't like this sort of thing, do they?
Correct. and we talked before about vigilant, but it's not just the FBI and not just the state and local police, but the non-disclosure agreement you mentioned. That's a Harris manufacturer non-disclosure agreement. They consider it a trade secret. To which groups like EFF say, if you think how your technology works is a trade secret, we don't want your technology. Come back when you're willing to tell us how this thing works.
If it violates the Constitution, you can't make that a trade secret.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
All right. We're running shorter on time than I had hoped. Let's get to the what do we do about this, and we still want to get to audience questions. We happen to live in an area where what's been called a precedent-setting ordinance by the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors passed earlier this year. Was it not in April or something like that? Tell us quickly about that. Why is it precedent-setting?
Yeah, so the problem, as hopefully has come across in our discussion so far, is this whack-a-mole. Just, there's millions of technology, I should say millions. There's a lot of technologies, there's a lot of police departments, they're being adopted in secret, and by the time we find out about them, it's been used invasively for, in the case of the cell site simulator, a decade or more. And it's very hard at that stage to put in place reasonable rules. The way it ought to work is to put the cart before the horse. And that's exactly what has happened in Santa Clara County. Joe Simidian and others, led successfully an effort to pass a law that says before any new surveillance technology is adopted, there has to be an open, transparent, democratic process where the agency that wants the new technology puts out a proposal. They put out a report of what the technology is and how they want to use it. They put out a proposed privacy guideline. It goes to the public, who has an opportunity to read it, to comment on it. Then there is a scheduled open public hearing by the in the case of Santa Clara County, by the Board of Commissioners. And the Board of Commissioners considers, after hearing from everybody, whether or not the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, including the privacy cost. And if they don't like what they're hearing, they send the police back to rewrite their privacy policy. And
so would this include the data retention part that
absolutely.
You started out saying was so important?
Absolutely. And so, once a process like this is up and running, at that point, groups like Peninsula Peace and Justice or the ACLU, EFF, Color of Justice, whoever, they read the policy and they say, is there enough protection at the front end where we're collecting information? Is there a probable cause warrant? Is there enough protection at the stage of sharing? Do we have a rule that says you don't give this to another agency unless there's probable cause of crime? Is there a reasonable retention period? In the case of the LPRs, are we going to delete it immediately or at least very quickly? And if the body politic does not like the privacy guidelines, then the technology doesn't get adopted.
Excellent. And all in public hearings.
Correct.
And it's hard to believe that this is the first law of its kind in the nation, but we can hope that this will really start something. And locally, it has started something in that a similar ordinance has been introduced at Palo Alto City Council.
Yes, Councilmember Corey Wolbach sponsored it, and in April of this year was successful by a vote of 7-0 to get the City Council to send it to the appropriate committee, where, as far as I know, it's currently being discussed by staff and others. And so I would hope that next year we will see some momentum on that. I'm happy to say also there are similar bills in Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda County, and BART.
Oh, BART, yeah.
Yeah, BART has
they have a police department, so they're going to have surveillance technology.
Yep, they've got a lot of surveillance cameras.
Yeah, so to me this is a real good local activism kind of thing, and certainly Peninsula Peace and Justice Center is going to be doing what we can to see that the Palo Alto one is passed, and I hope people who are Palo Alto residents will be watching for our announcements and come support this at committee meetings and city council meetings. But we need to get this started in other towns as well because of this whack-a-mole effect. Every town is going to need one of these. And hopefully, instead of coming up with tightly written rules for how they can use this, we can actually stop the acquisition of some of these things before they even get bought through this public hearings process.
Absolutely. I think in the case of some technologies, the answer is don't get it at all.
Yeah.
I think in the case of others, it might be, well, okay, if you've got a tight enough policy, but that's for each community to figure out on its own, but through the same transparent process.
Yeah, I read one criticism of this ordinance that passed in Santa Clara, that doing this, endorsing this kind of thing is kind of endorsing surveillance. And I just don't buy that, because this gives us a process to stop the purchase of this technology before the check gets written.
Yeah, I completely agree. The status quo is that law enforcement is getting the technologies, and this proposal will stop some technologies from being acquired and ensure that others are properly regulated. And I don't see it at all as an endorsement of buying any particular technology.
Yeah, speaking of particular technologies, I think one of the aspects of Joe Simitian's bill, which did pass, he called it future-proof. You want to explain that just briefly? Is it broad enough that something that hasn't been invented yet would be covered under this?
That's right. Basically what it says is before the government acquires a, quote, surveillance technology, you've got to do all these procedural things. And surveillance technology is defined broadly enough so that it's future-proof, so that when they come up with, the chip they're sticking in our brains without us knowing, that's also covered, even though it's not listed, in a concise list of the known spying technologies. 15 years ago, the government was using the cell site simulator on battlefields, and no one in the public knew about it. So who knows what technologies they're using now that we don't know about, and of course, who knows what technologies will be invented, that we haven't thought of yet.
Yeah. Let's get to the audience if we have some questions. And can I find out how much time we have left? If you have a question or a comment, just put up your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you. Crystal is coming right in. And if you would stand up and make it easier on our camera people, that would be great.
So I have some concern about this license plate reader, even if it's used so-called in a legitimate fashion. So here's a scenario that I'm thinking. There's a license plate goes by, it goes into the reader, and it's discovered that this car has a broken tail light or has changed lanes without a turn signal, and there's a ticket that hasn't been paid. And there's a lot of communities that are making their money, like Ferguson is the prime example, but it's more and more that are attacking poor people, and this would be the ticket to do that.
I 100% agree with what you said. The study that was done earlier this year in Marin County, their capture of millions of plates, the 0.02% that hit some kind of list, 85% of it was something wrong with the license plate. And which begs the question, should the government be spending its time in this manner trying to catch traffic scofflaws? And the view of the EFF is that often the answer is no. Being a traffic scofflaw, owing a $100 ticket is not the kind of thing that should, subject you to this kind of surveillance. And, as you say, there is this color of surveillance angle, where, as you say, there are communities where most people have a outstanding ticket of one kind or another, which means these technologies would be subjecting most of the community to surveillance. And of course, in some communities, this is not a casual thing to suddenly be subjected to a traffic stop because of, you haven't paid your $85 ticket because you didn't change lanes properly, 3 months earlier. There are people getting arrested, and then it's just the rest of the all the horrible things that can follow from, a bad traffic stop. And so I may have misspoken earlier. What I mean to say is that the most troubling thing to do with it is to be building up a database of where people who aren't even matched are caught. But even as to the people who there's some kind of match, the predicate question needs to be, what are the small number of people that we really ought to be looking for? Maybe a terrorist, maybe an Amber Alert situation, someone who's wanted for a violent felony. But I wouldn't add traffic scofflaws to that list. And I want to be clear also, I'm not endorsing even acquiring the ALPR in the first place. But certainly if you're going to have one, you ought to define extremely narrowly what are the predicate offenses that could lead to you being identified and stopped.
Which jurisdictions around here have the ALPRs?
Kind of all over. Palo Alto has one. San Francisco has them. Oakland has them. They're one of the more common spying technologies that are out there right now.
Yeah, if you go to the EFF website, EFF.org, and just search on ALPR, you'll find this report that Adam mentioned earlier that I looked at to go check my own jurisdictions, and you can find out if they're in your town, check out the policy, go to city council and say, does your policy include this stuff? And let them know that you know they have it. That's one thing to begin with.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just one more thing on LPR. And I don't think I said this earlier, but it's really important. EFF got from Oakland the data on where they have been driving around with their ALPR devices, and it maps basically perfectly to where the black communities are. And so really just, you cannot talk about spying technology without talking about the color of surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely. Any more questions or comments in the audience here? Not seeing any hands right now. Try to think of something in the next 7 minutes. Well, I'll make an exception for someone who's already asked a question.
The license plate readers, are they also in the, is it the same thing that's in the traffic lights that are, automatically giving tickets?
I'm not sure. Well, a technology that exists, which might or might not be what you're describing, is the traffic cameras. And so the traffic cameras have a few things going on. One is the ability to detect a traffic violation, and that might be through a camera that's perceiving someone running a red. It might be a sensor on the road that detects the same thing. It might be a radar detector that knows someone's going fast. And once the technology has identified that someone has broken the law, then they have to document who has broken the law. And that is a technology which is basically the same as an LPR. It snaps a picture of the license plate. So there's an overlap between the two technologies. Although usually when we talk about ALPRs, we're talking about a device that is not connected to detecting a traffic violation.
All right, good questions. How hard was it for Joe Simidian to get this bill passed? It wasn't like a no-brainer at the Supervisors, was it? And it took a lot of grassroots activist support.
It did. It did. It was a struggle that went on for a full year. I think that Commissioner Simidian deserves a great deal of credit for his stamina and his leadership and really bringing together a lot of different stakeholders to hammer out a bill that could pass. It ultimately passed 5-0, in the county commission. I think it also speaks to the real groundswell of grassroots support for the bill. So of course the Peninsula Peace and Justice was there, ACLU, EFF, Oakland, Privacy Working Group, Color of Justice, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Dozens of organizations put a lot of effort into passing this law. And if it can pass in Santa Clara, it really could pass anywhere. I mean, Santa Clara has millions of people. It has a very sophisticated, law enforcement community, and I think it's a real source of optimism for me and for other activists that if it's not like we passed this in a tiny little town or a particularly left-wing community. Santa Clara County is in many ways very comparable to other big cities across America, and if we could do it there, we should be able to do it anywhere.
And home of where a lot of this stuff is getting invented and profits generated from.
That also is true.
Yeah.
Although I'm not aware of any of the people who are profiting on these technologies opposing the legislation.
Really? What kind of opposition was there? Did the Sheriff's Department, I'm trying to think, I guess at the county level, there is just the Sheriff's Department, maybe the jail, but I don't know if the jail is using surveillance technology.
I think that the elected district attorney and the elected sheriff of Santa Clara County did oppose the law. They did work with Commissioner Simidian to try to work something out. Their opposition, as I understood it, and I have no particular knowledge of what's going on in their offices. I only know what they were saying publicly in letters and testimony. But they seem to have two concerns. One is that they wanted, frankly, more flexibility as law enforcement to get the technologies that they thought would keep people safe, and and the other is that there's kind of a peculiar county government issue which does not exist for the state or local government, which is that there's essentially power sharing between the commissioners who have the power of the purse and the sheriff and the district attorney who are independently elected officials with their own prerogatives. And they claimed that the ordinance as enacted would potentially violate their constitutional prerogatives under the state constitution. But EFF and the rest of the advocates and the 5 commissioners who voted for the bill did not accept that argument.
Who controls the sheriff's purse strings?
The commission.
Yeah, I would think so. So that's kind of the ultimate say,
Yeah.
right? And I was struck, we first met when the similar bill was introduced at Palo Alto City Council, and you testified, and I did, and somebody from Oakland, someone from ACLU. And the chief of police was sitting in the audience, and he wasn't there to testify, but the city council asked him to come up, and he didn't seem to have a problem with this. He said he would support it.
Yeah, I mean, if I understood what he said right, he thought that this legislation was consistent with the values of the Palo Alto Police Department, and that was a very nice thing to hear that evening.
Yeah, and have you read the Palo Alto ordinance? Is it as strong as the Santa Clara County one?
Well, as I understand it, there is not actually a draft bill at this point in Palo Alto. I'm new to the community, but as I understand it, it begins with a Dear Colleagues memo from a particular number of council members to the whole council saying, let's send this general subject matter to our staff and to a committee of ourselves for further discussion. So I don't think there's a particular bill yet. As soon as there is one, EFF and other groups hope to be involved with, hammering out something that is very much like.
Yeah, that is how it will work. The Policy and Services Committee, and what was adopted were broad guidelines, an ordinance establishing a general policy governing consideration, adoption, and use of surveillance and information gathering technologies. 20 seconds, any closing thoughts on what we can do as citizens here to...
I think that all of these technologies that are so intrusive of our civil liberties, the common denominator is that they're being adopted in secret. And what we need is an open, transparent, fair, democratic process to ensure that the people are heard before these technologies are adopted. And I think if we have that rule, we will end up with fewer of these spying technologies, and when we do have them, they'll be better regulated spying technologies.
Adam Schwartz from the Electronic Freedom Foundation, thanks so much for joining us here on Other Voices.